The air hung thick and wet over the detention camp, a heavy, motionless silence after days of tropical rain. It was late August 1945. The war was over, but for these women, surrender had only just begun. A line of exhausted Japanese nurses and clerks stood barefoot on the muddy ground, their khaki uniforms clinging to their skin. Behind them, a barbed wire fence shimmered in the humid heat, and beyond it, the sea rolled quietly. The same sea that once carried the Empire's ambitions across the Pacific. American military police watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. An interpreter stepped forward, voice steady yet distant. "Remove your clothing. Medical inspection." The words struck like a physical blow. Eyes widened, hands trembled. For women raised in a culture where modesty was sacred, the order felt unbearable, a humiliation deeper than defeat itself. No one moved. Only the faint buzz of flies broke the stillness. Then, slowly, one woman stepped forward, and in that small, hesitant motion, the weight of Japan's surrender became human. By mid-1945, the Pacific War was collapsing in on Japan like a tightening noose. The once mighty Imperial Navy had been shattered, its carriers and battleships lying at the bottom of the sea. Cities from Tokyo to Nagasaki were reduced to ashes under relentless American air raids. The empire that once stretched from Manchuria to the South Pacific was shrinking, day by day, island by island. On these scattered islands, not only soldiers, but thousands of civilians served in support roles: clerks, typists, medics, and nurses. Many were women who had volunteered through patriotic organizations like the Dai Nippon Fujinkai, Greater Japan Women's Association. They were told they would be serving the emperor, tending to the wounded, and standing as symbols of purity and sacrifice. Few imagined they would ever face capture, for the imperial code left no room for surrender. As Allied forces advanced through the Philippines, Borneo, and New Guinea, these women found themselves caught in the chaos of retreat. Some served in frontline hospitals hastily built from bamboo and canvas. Others worked in communications, nursing, or logistics alongside army units that were soon surrounded and overrun. When American and Australian troops moved inland, entire Japanese medical detachments were left exposed. Many of the nurses had no combat training. Their commanding officers, bound by the Bushido spirit, often chose suicide rather than capture. But when the order for mass surrender finally came from Tokyo on August 15, 1945, the illusion of honor through death began to crumble. On remote islands, small groups of survivors emerged from the jungles, emaciated, feverish, and terrified. Among them were these women, still wearing faded armbands marked with the Red Cross of Imperial Japan. Their capture was not violent. Allied soldiers, expecting ambushes or traps, were surprised to see young Japanese women stepping out of the trees with white cloths raised in trembling hands. Some carried wounded comrades on improvised stretchers. Others clutched photographs or family relics they refused to abandon. They were gathered, registered, and placed in makeshift detention centers, former airfields or temporary camps under Allied medical supervision. For the first time in years, they received clean water and food. Yet behind their silence lay a deep cultural terror. The shame of being taken alive, the fear of dishonor, and the haunting propaganda that warned Japanese women of unspeakable treatment if captured by the enemy. Now, in the damp stillness of the Pacific, those fears would soon be tested. When the Allied command began processing Japanese prisoners in the closing months of 1945, their procedures followed a strict and humane structure built over years of war. By then, the Allies had captured thousands of Japanese soldiers across the Pacific, along with a smaller number of civilian and female personnel. Each new arrival underwent the same regulated sequence: disarmament, medical inspection, registration, and quarantine. The purpose was practical: to prevent disease, identify individuals, and ensure humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. American and Australian forces had learned from hard experience that tropical battlefields bred malaria, dysentery, and infections that spread rapidly in crowded camps. Every incoming prisoner, regardless of rank or gender, was subject to full medical examination. But, to the Japanese women, this order, "Remove your clothing," was more than a routine inspection. It was a cultural earthquake. Japan's wartime ideology had raised its women to embody purity and self-sacrifice. Female virtue was bound to the nation's honor, and modesty was non-negotiable. Propaganda had long warned that surrender meant not only death, but dishonor beyond redemption. Japanese military women, though not combatants, were drilled in these same values: to destroy documents, to die before capture, and never to be seen in a state of undress before foreign men. So when Allied medics and interpreters tried to explain the inspection procedure, they faced not defiance but paralyzing silence. The women did not understand that these examinations were meant to protect them, to check for wounds, disease, and malnutrition. All they heard was an impossible command that clashed with everything they had been taught since childhood. The Allied officers themselves were uncertain. Many had never processed female prisoners before. They understood that what was routine for Western procedure was a grave violation in Japanese eyes. Some camp commanders requested female nurses or medical staff to conduct the inspections, but shortages and chaos made that impossible in the first days after surrender. For the Japanese women, humiliation mingled with disbelief. They had spent years imagining the enemy as monsters, faceless figures from propaganda leaflets who tortured and violated captives. Now, as they faced the foreign soldiers in reality, they found something they had never prepared for: restraint. The guards kept their distance. No mocking words, no blows. The inspections were brief, clinical, and respectful within the limits of wartime procedure. But in that strange, conflicted silence, between fear and humanity, something began to shift. For the first time, these women saw their enemy not as demons, but as men bound by order and discipline, much like themselves. That fragile realization would form the heart of what came next. A moment of shock, compassion, and disbelief that none of them would ever forget. The human angle of that moment was defined by silence, not the calm silence of peace, but the suffocating kind that follows the collapse of everything once believed. These Japanese women, nurses, clerks, volunteers, had lived through bombings, starvation, and battlefield horror. Yet nothing prepared them for the humiliation of surrender. Standing half-shielded by torn canvas, they faced the unthinkable, exposing themselves before the enemy. Many shook uncontrollably. Some turned away, clutching each other's arms for courage. Others wept quietly, not from physical pain, but from a loss so deep it could not be named. The loss of dignity, of identity, of everything Imperial Japan had promised them. And yet, beneath that fear, a faint instinct to survive stirred. When one woman complied, others followed. The will to live, however fragile, had begun to outweigh the weight of shame. The tactical angle reveals why this order had been given in the first place. For the Allies, the capture of Japanese personnel, particularly medical and clerical staff, was not only about humane detention, but also about intelligence. These women had been stationed near field hospitals, signal posts, or supply lines. They carried documents, coded messages, or information about troop movements hidden within their clothing or personal belongings. Search and inspection were crucial steps in ensuring no hidden weapons or classified materials slipped through. Allied officers had learned the hard way that even non-combatants could be used as couriers or saboteurs by the Imperial Army. Every inspection, therefore, was part of the broader machinery of military security. Cold, procedural, and indifferent to emotion, but beneath the layers of fear and duty lay the medical angle, the most practical, yet least understood by the prisoners. Many of the women had tropical ulcers, malaria, lice, and untreated wounds. Some were severely malnourished, their ribs visible beneath their uniforms. Allied doctors knew that without immediate screening, contagious diseases could spread through entire camps. The inspections, however humiliating, were acts of triage, identifying those who needed isolation, care, or hospital transfer. Medical teams worked under strict military discipline, their instruments sterilized, their movements efficient. Yet, to the women, it was incomprehensible. The same enemy that had bombed their homeland was now examining them with care and precision. It was a collision between survival instinct and procedure, between fear and necessity. The camp that day was not a place of cruelty, nor of comfort. It was a fragile intersection where war met humanity, and both sides struggled to understand what the other truly meant. The cultural angle of this encounter ran far deeper than uniforms or orders. For the Japanese women, modesty was not merely social etiquette, it was spiritual armor. From childhood, they had been taught that a woman's body represented the purity of her family and the honor of her nation. To reveal it before men, especially foreign men, was unthinkable. In the imperial worldview, even death was preferable to disgrace. That was why so many Japanese women in occupied territories had chosen suicide over capture. Those who survived did so under unbearable internal conflict, torn between obedience to Allied authority and devotion to their own code of honor. To the Allied personnel, however, the situation carried an entirely different meaning. Most of them were Americans and Australians raised under Western medical and military systems that emphasized procedure, hygiene, and discipline over sentiment. They viewed the inspection as a practical step, not a violation. The cultural gulf between the two sides was immense, and no interpreter could bridge it fully. Even when Allied officers tried to assure the women of safety, their words carried little weight against years of wartime propaganda that painted Westerners as savages. Yet what happened in those following hours revealed something quietly profound. The moral and ethical angle emerged not from speeches or orders, but from restraint, the rarest form of power in war. Allied medics followed regulations with precision, but also with an unspoken understanding of the prisoner's humiliation. They spoke softly, avoided eye contact, and ensured that only essential personnel were present. The examinations were brief, and the women were quickly given blankets or clean garments afterward. No mocking, no exploitation, no cruelty. It was in those gestures, small, procedural, almost invisible, that a moral line was drawn. For the first time, these women encountered an enemy who did not act as their propaganda had warned. They expected violence. They received silence. They anticipated degradation. They found order. That contrast struck deeper than any words could. For the Allied soldiers, too, it was a sobering moment. After years of brutal fighting against an enemy known for fanaticism and cruelty, here they stood before women who looked terrified, fragile, and utterly defeated. It forced them to confront the human cost of victory and to recognize that mercy could carry as much weight as firepower. The inspection ended quietly, without incident. Yet for everyone present, it marked a turning point, a moment when war's brutality gave way, however briefly, to decency. And from that fragile exchange of fear and restraint, the next phase of this story, the true emotional climax, began to unfold. The command was repeated softly through the interpreter. This time the words hung heavier in the air, leaving no room for doubt. The women stood motionless, their faces pale beneath the sunburn and dirt. For a moment, it seemed the entire camp had stopped breathing. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, one of the nurses stepped forward. Her name was recorded only as Sato, a 24-year-old field medic from the Philippines detachment. She moved with trembling hands, eyes fixed on the ground, as she began to comply. No one spoke. The Allied guards looked away. The medics prepared their instruments, murmuring quietly to one another. That first act broke the paralysis. One by one, others followed, hesitantly, mechanically, like ghosts moving through an unfamiliar ritual. The canvas sheets rustled in the humid air. The sound of boots shifting in the mud was the only reminder that this was still a military space. The interpreters spoke gently, assuring them it was for their health, that no harm would come. But reassurance meant little. For these women, each gesture felt like stepping beyond the edge of life itself. A slow, conscious surrender not just of control, but of everything they had believed about duty, womanhood, and Japan. Some covered their faces with their hands. Others bit their lips to keep from crying. A few stared straight ahead, unblinking, as if detaching their minds from what their bodies endured. The Allied medics, aware of the cultural gravity of the act, moved with deliberate professionalism. Their gloved hands were steady. Their words were minimal. To them, this was procedure, necessary, clinical. To the women, it was the collapse of identity. And yet, in that unbearable silence, something began to change. The women realized that no one was mocking them. No leering, no laughter, no violence, just the steady rhythm of routine. A stethoscope, a clipboard, a quiet nod. The very normalcy of it felt surreal. They had been taught to expect monsters, but found men working methodically, respectfully, even kindly. When the inspection ended, a medic handed each woman a clean blanket and directed her toward a shaded tent. The gesture was small, but its meaning vast. What had begun as humiliation became, unexpectedly, the first fragile thread of trust. By the time the final woman left the line, the camp was silent again. The war was over. The empire had fallen. And in the still air of that Pacific outpost, both captors and captives stood at the thin, trembling border between vengeance and humanity. When the last inspection concluded, the medics packed their instruments in silence. The tropical air was still heavy, but the tension had shifted. The women, now wrapped in coarse Allied blankets, sat together in the shade of a canvas tent. Some stared blankly at the ground. Others whispered quietly among themselves. The tears that had been held back during the ordeal now came freely, not from pain, but from something stranger, harder to name. They had survived. Across the compound, the Allied officers completed their reports. Every entry was brief. Japanese female POW, examined, cleared. Yet, behind those impersonal words was a scene none of them would forget. They had expected resistance, hysteria, perhaps even violence. Instead, they had witnessed a quiet dignity that unnerved them. These women, stripped of rank, of flag, of the armor of belief, still carried themselves with a grace that defied their circumstances. And for the prisoners, the realization dawned slowly. They had been treated not as enemies to be punished, but as human beings. The Western soldiers had shown restraint, professionalism, and even a strange form of compassion. That discovery unsettled them more than humiliation ever could. It contradicted everything imperial propaganda had burned into their minds. The enemy, they now understood, was not a beast, but a mirror, reflecting back the same fragility and decency they had believed existed only in Japan. That night, the camp was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of insects. Some of the women wrote in hidden notebooks or whispered prayers for home. Others could not sleep, haunted by conflicting emotions, shame and gratitude, defeat and relief. A few even spoke softly to the camp nurses who brought them food, exchanging broken words of English and Japanese. The barriers were still there, but thinner now. In the officer's tent, the Allied commander wrote a short note in his log: "Inspection complete. No incidents. Conducted with full discipline." He didn't record the expressions on the women's faces, nor the uneasy respect that lingered in the air afterward. But every man present knew that something subtle had shifted. not in the outcome of war, but in the understanding of what victory meant. When dawn broke, the women emerged for roll call, cleaner, calmer, their posture straighter. The fear had not vanished, but something like acceptance had taken its place. They were still prisoners, but they were alive, and they had glimpsed the faintest trace of mercy within defeat. That small, almost invisible transformation marked the true turning point. For in a world burned by years of hatred, the simplest act of restraint had become revolutionary. In the days that followed, the camp settled into a rhythm, rigid, quiet, almost mechanical. Each morning began with roll call beneath the flagpole, followed by rations and assigned duties. The Japanese women were placed in separate quarters, given light tasks in the infirmary and kitchen. Though they were prisoners, they were no longer treated as enemy combatants. Instead, they became part of the slow machinery of reconstruction, small, silent witnesses to the end of an empire. At first, many refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. Others hid their faces from Allied photographers, fearing that shame would follow them home. Yet as days passed, the barriers began to crumble. The same medics who had inspected them now treated their wounds, vaccinated them, and offered medicine unavailable in wartime Japan. Gradually, suspicion gave way to fragile trust. Some of the women began to write. On scraps of Allied stationery, they recorded fragments of thought. Not for propaganda, not for history, but for themselves. One nurse described the impossible kindness of her captors. Another wrote of the ache of silence that followed surrender. "I expected death," one letter read, "but I was given life, and I do not know how to accept it." The Allied officers, too, observed their prisoners with a quiet respect. Reports from camp commanders noted the discipline and composure of the women, their willingness to work, and their meticulous care for cleanliness. A few Allied nurses who visited the camp later recalled how the Japanese women, though gaunt and frail, insisted on bowing before speaking, a small ritual of dignity in a world that had lost all order. Evenings were the hardest. When the lights went out, the women would whisper prayers or fragments of songs from home. Some cried softly, others simply stared into the darkness. The shame of survival lingered heavier than any physical wound. They had lived through the unthinkable, the surrender their empire swore would never come. And now they faced the slow, uncertain process of existing in a world that no longer matched their beliefs. The camp itself became a strange reflection of that change, a place where compassion quietly coexisted with control, and where the remnants of two enemy nations shared the same humid air, waiting for ships that would carry them toward uncertain futures. By early 1946, the orders for repatriation began to circulate through the Pacific camps. The war crimes tribunals were underway in Tokyo, and Allied command was eager to return all remaining non-combatant prisoners to Japanese soil. For the women in this remote detention camp, the announcement brought mixed emotions, relief, dread, and confusion intertwined. They would be free, yes. But what awaited them in Japan was not celebration nor comfort. It was silence, and, for many, rejection. When the transport ships arrived, the women were given clean Allied uniforms marked POW in bold letters, their names and medical records attached to small cardboard tags. The voyage home was long and subdued. They watched the ocean stretch endlessly before them, unsure what kind of homeland would greet them after defeat. Some prayed quietly. Others stared at the horizon, afraid to imagine the faces of their families. Upon arrival in Yokohama and other ports, Japanese officials processed them quickly. There were no parades, no embraces. The country they returned to was in ruins, bombed, burned, and struggling for food. Worse still, many civilians regarded returning POWs with suspicion. To have been captured alive was seen as a stain of dishonor, a mark of weakness. Women especially were judged harshly. Some hid their past completely. telling neighbors they had worked in hospitals or government offices rather than admitting they had been prisoners. A few of the nurses wrote anonymous accounts years later, describing how their time in Allied captivity had changed them. They spoke not of humiliation, but of awakening, of realizing that mercy could exist even in war. One recalled how an American medic offered her a cup of water before she fainted during inspection. "In that moment," she wrote, "I realized we had been wrong. Our enemy had a heart." These recollections remained buried for decades, overshadowed by the louder narratives of heroism and suffering, yet they revealed something profound. That defeat, in its rawest form, stripped away illusions and revealed a shared humanity long hidden beneath uniforms and flags. For the Allied officers who recorded those final reports, the memory of those Japanese women lingered as well. They represented not victory, but a lesson, that the real end of war does not come with silence of guns, but with the recognition of human dignity, even in the enemy's eyes. And as the ships disappeared into the mist toward Japan, the camp fell quiet again, its purpose fulfilled, its echoes fading into history. Years after the war's end, the memory of that day, the inspections, the fear, the silence, no longer burned with the same intensity. It had softened, like old photographs left in the sun. Those who lived through it, both the captors and the captured, found themselves changed in ways they could never have imagined. For the Japanese women, the war had begun with loyalty and pride. It ended with surrender and shame. Yet, within that surrender, they discovered something their nation had long denied them: the fragile, powerful truth of mercy. The Allied medics who treated them did not see enemies. They saw humans, frightened, exhausted, and deserving of care. That simple act of restraint and decency would linger far longer than any battle cry. Among the Allied ranks, too, something shifted. Many who had once spoken of the enemy in abstract terms began to see faces instead. Faces of women who trembled not from guilt, but from fear. That moment of understanding did not erase the horrors of war, but it reminded them why they had fought. Not to destroy humanity, but to defend it. When peace returned, it was not marked by victory parades or grand speeches for those who had been in that camp. It came quietly, in the way a nurse hesitated before judging another, in the way a soldier taught his son that compassion was not weakness,